Hi, this is our Narconica project on the removal of invasive species from the utility stand. I'm Ashley, this is Mackenzie, we're both wildlife majors. So our objectives of this project was to remove Bradford pear, Chinese tallow, and Chinese privet from the utility stand. This helps promote native species and fire facilitation. Many invasive species are not fire adapted and they do not burn well. They're also shade tolerant, which helps keep them reproducing because native species can't grow in the shade. The utility stand is maintained by fire, and invasive species result in a very patchy, incomplete burn of the stand. Bradford pear also has very stiff thorns that make it very difficult to timber cruise, and it's not ideal. The proposed plan following the removal of all of these invasive species is to plant pond pine in the utility stand. This will further help facilitate the fire through the stand.
So the timeline for our project, on August 20th, the stakeholder questions were due. On August 23rd, the field work began in the utility stand to remove the invasive species. On September 3rd, our project proposal was due to our stakeholder just to clarify all of our objectives and then the supplies we needed to complete this task. On September 27th, that was the deadline for the completion of our field work for removing the invasive species. And then on October 28th, the final report will be due to our stakeholder, clarifying all of our objectives and if we met them, and then the issues we ran across while doing this.
And both of us had to put 10 hours of work in between August 23rd and October 29th. We weren't out there at the same time many times, but it resulted in 20 hours of work. So this is some of our stakeholder questions that we asked. We asked how work should be divided between 3 groups. That's 6 people out in the utility stand at the same time. I noticed that the other 2 groups were staying in the back of the stand near the railroad tracks, so we tended to stay in the main utility stand and work on the smaller stems. Our main objective of the removing invasive species was to improve aesthetics, to promote native species, and to help fire facilitation. We asked also if there were any native species that we needed to remove, because sometimes some native species can become a nuisance, but there were none. We just focused on those 3 invasive species. We also asked if there were some species that emphasis should be put on, because there were time constraints, but we worked from the north to south end and just picked up where we left off. Stems were just left where they were cut at. I guess fire will take care of them. Dr. Lane, our stakeholder, did not want them to be disposed of anywhere.
So an invasive species is defined by NOAA as an animal or plant from another region of the world that doesn't belong in their new environment. Invasive species can lead to the extinction of natural plants and animals and completely destroy the biodiversity and the habitat of the original area. Our target species was Chinese tallow, Chinese privet, and Bradford pear. All 3 of these species originate from Asia, and Bradford pear was brought over by the Department of Agriculture in the 1960s as an ornamental species.
And all of these are also shade tolerant, like I said before. They help reproduce other invasive species because it creates shade, and like I said, most native species that we're promoting in that area are not shade tolerant. So we use 2 different types of herbicides in the area. Glyphosate is only foliar active, so we were able to put that on the species that were in close proximity to other native species or species we didn't want to kill. That was diluted to 25%. Triclopyr was applied at 50% to individuals that were close to other invasive species because they have a minor soil active effect. That means it soaks into the soil and it can kill surrounding plants. We also added a surfactant to make sure that the herbicides adhered to the surfaces that we applied them to better. We also put a blue dye in the herbicide to make sure that we didn't treat stumps twice and to make sure that we got them all and didn't leave any untreated.
So for cut stump treatments, it's important to follow like a certain steps The first step is to cut the stump as low to the ground as possible. This reduces tripping hazard while you're working in the stand. And then you should apply herbicide to the entire stump, ensuring that you cover it completely. The herbicide that you have applied will then be carried to the roots and the remaining plant tissue, ensuring that the plant does indeed die. If you don't follow these steps properly, then you could potentially be wasting your time because the species could sprout back.
And you can also see here that we got a little sloppy on the herbicide application, which is a big deal if you're taking prices into consideration. The spray bottles are definitely hard to spray close to the ground because you're not holding it centered. You're tipping it over so it doesn't get into the nozzle that great. Yeah, definitely try to keep it on the stump rather than spraying everything around it because then you could kill things that you didn't want to kill. We used cut stump treatment because there were no large woody stems in our area that required hack and squirt. Hack and squirt's typically used done by a hatchet and a spray bottle. You can also create snags from using hack and squirt, which are really important in wildlife settings. But sometimes, even if it is a big tree, you don't want a snag sitting by your house, so they just cut it down and then spray the stump to ensure that it's dead. Cut stump treatment is typically used on woody vegetation that you can cut with loppers or something small. It's used for areas where you don't want snags. Hack and squirt, like I said, is used on larger vegetation where you don't want the snags at. This picture shows how they carefully sprayed the cambium of the tree. The cambium is the living, growing tissue of the tree. So if that is not completely sprayed, there is a chance that it will stump sprout and your work will be useless because the tree is just going to grow right back and you're going to have to go out there and do it again, which, like I said, if you're taking prices into consideration, that's not really efficient. However, you do want to cover the entire stump to make sure that it is dead because you don't want to do it 2-3 times and waste your time.
So this is showing the before and after of us removing a clump of Bradford pear. In the before picture, you can see actually how thick the Bradford pear is and how much shade it does provide for the understory, which is not good for the native species. And then in the after, you can see how much sunlight is now hitting the floor, which will indeed promote the growth of the native species that we want in the utility stand.
And you can also see how many dead stems were produced from that single Bradford pear thicket. Like I said, we left the stems where they were at because they're going to decompose, and when and if fire is run through there this next year, it will be taken care of and returned to the soil. So this is a picture of where we sprayed Chinese tallow stems. As you can see, there's 4, 5, 6 stems in one single thicket. They can grow from a single stem, but they're typically in multiple stems, making it very difficult to remove and find. If you don't spray the stem immediately after you cut it down, chances are you're going to lose it and your work is going to be pointless. So if you cut one stem at a time and spray it and make sure it's, blue, then you're good. This, like I said, it makes for a difficult removal. All the stems need to be sprayed because you don't know whether or not it's another seed that has dropped there or if it's sprouting from the same root system. So if you don't spray all of them, there's a chance that there's a separate seed, there's a separate root system, and it's just going to sprout again, and you're going to have to do it again. They're also very prolific seed producers. That's also why they form thickets. They're very difficult to remove from an area because if you do not get all of the stems and you do not kill the roots, then that particular thicket is going to resprout. And there's also seeds in the soil that it's virtually impossible. Bradford pear and Chinese privet also grow in a similar fashion. They can grow from a singular stem, but it's typically multiple stems, making it very difficult to remove.
So this shows the before and after of us removing a Chinese tallow thicket. In the first image of the pre-removal, it doesn't look like it's that thick of a clump, but on the image of the removed stems, you can see how many individual stems were actually in there and how thick it really is. In the middle image, the post removal, you can see how open the understory now is and how much light can now penetrate the floor to allow the growth of native species.
And all of these stems were removed by loppers. Hatchets really didn't work for this. We had hatchets in case we had to use hack and squirt, but we used only loppers in a spray bottle because all the stems were relatively small. So this is some nice photos of Mackenzie removing some tallow. She had to remove the stem from the area in which she cut it because if you, like you can see, the forbs are really thick as well. So if you don't spray the stem immediately after you cut the stem, you're not going to find it. She's obviously carrying the weight of the team, considering I am on my phone taking pictures, but sometimes it's got to be like that. You can't do all the work yourself.
So this slide explains why it's extremely important to use protective gloves. We started out using gloves, but because of the hot weather and the presence of blackberry and the Bradford pear in the stand, it just became too hard to just keep changing gloves because of tears and all that. So we just decided not to use gloves, which was kind of a mistake on our end, but oh well. At one day we were removing Bradford pear and one of the thorns poked Ashley's bottle and it started leaking all over her, and that's why her hand is completely blue, and this could have been...
They're white.
This could have been prevented by us using gloves.
Yeah, those jeans are no longer with me. I used a pumice stone. I figured out that that is the correct way to remove glyphosate from your hands. Just scrape off the first 3 or 4 layers and you'll get all of the dye off. Note to self. So this is a picture of the before we started removing. You can see in this picture, if my cursor will show up, all of the broadleaf plants. All of this is mostly Bradford pear and tallow. We did not have much Chinese privet in the main stand, but on the northern end we did have a few stems. You can definitely see how much shade is produced on the floor underneath these broadleaf plants. And obviously some is from the pines, but a lot of the broadleaf plants are blocking the sunlight from the forest. This is an after picture. You can see that there's not many broadleaf plants. Can't tell what this is, but this is in fact native. You can see that there's a lot of forbs and grasses in this picture, which is good. Those are the native species that helps facilitate fire. Like I said, the invasive species are not fire adapted, so oftentimes the fire will burn to that species and then it will just burn out, resulting in a patchy burn. And those invasive species are not controlled, so when you get an open forest floor after you burn, those invasive species are going to very quickly colonize those areas and continue to spread. Hence why we had to remove them with herbicide. That was our presentation on our Rec and Eco project. I hope that everyone enjoyed our riveting presentation over invasive species removal. Had a great time doing it. Love that I lost a pair of jeans, but we made it through it.
It wasn't that bad. It was okay.